Efforts to revitalize urban neighborhoods go back at least to the war on poverty in the 1960s. But instead of government spending combined with grassroots empowerment, the more recent efforts hinge on private funders, market investment, and a different kind of community representation, often with elected officials being sidelined. That's the new landscape explored in a book by our guest, focusing on the Fairmount Corridor. It's called Constructing Community: Urban Governance, Development, and Inequality in Boston. We'd like to welcome the author, currently an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, Jeremy R. Levine. Thank you very much for being with us, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Jeremy, I want to see if we can start with a sort of a long view here, because we follow what's going on with the transportation and housing development along the Fairmont Corridor in recent years, but compare the difference in community process around that to what we had, let's say, in the late 60s when officials tried to solve a housing crisis with something called B-Burg.
That's right. One of the big, I think, most massive transformations that has happened since the 1960s is a real reshuffling of both the players around the table, as well as the sort of norms of operating and coordinating amongst them. So if we go back, 50, 60 years, this is right in the thick of what is referred to as urban renewal. And this is really government-led, large part destruction of particularly poor urban neighborhoods. In Boston, most famously, the West End, in other cities like Detroit, Black Bottom. And this is really a top-down affair. City government targeting particular neighborhoods to revitalize whatever that might mean. Largely that meant destroying and displacing. And local organizations doing their best, but mostly having a difficult time contesting against government's plans. What has happened over the course of the last 50 years is a real transformation in the growth, in particular, of a very large, vibrant sector of nonprofit organizations, both particular groups that do the kind of development that city government once did during the period of urban renewal, the community development corporations, or CDCs, but also a number of other organizations that work alongside them doing other similar efforts. A number of foundations and philanthropic organizations that have really blossomed and exploded across the last 50 years as well, giving more money to those nonprofits to do that work. And so there's different players around the table, and there's also a different orientation of collaboration. These organizations are now doing a lot less contestation, a lot less protesting, a lot less sort of knocking on city hall's doors and demanding more resources, and a lot more sitting around tables together in city hall, sitting around tables together in those nonprofit conference rooms to work collaboratively and collectively on what might be done, particularly in the city's poorest neighborhoods.
Somewhere halfway between in the long view of history, we have the example of the Southwest Corridor, where you saw this progression from protest to a new vision and collaboration from government eventually. But what about the Fairmont Corridor? How did that idea develop about transit-oriented development and the access to train service?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story that if you only looked at public information, you might elevate that contested sort of protest type story, but the reality was a little bit more collaborative as well. So the story of the Fairmount Corridor really begins a little bit later. There's certain elements that happened in development around those neighborhoods, but the key component, or the key event that really precipitated what we see today in the development around the new stations really started with Marvin Martin at the Greater Four Corners Action Coalition. Marvin Martin was working in Four Corners, saw this train that was running down the neighborhood, but no station in that neighborhood. And he got together with Noah Berger, who at the time was at the MBTA. And he said, Noah, there's an issue here. There should be a station here. It would better serve our residents of Four Corners. It would help them from getting quickly to downtown rather than taking a bus to get to the T and then get to downtown. It would really help us in our efforts of bringing resources to the neighborhood. Now, that was happening behind the scenes. What then happened publicly was a protest at the Four Corners station, organized with both Marvin Martin as well as the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation, a CDC from Upham's Corner, that was covered in the press. But then, so you might only think that there was this sort of protest that really precipitated it. But behind the scenes, it was Marvin and Noah and others talking together, working around, sitting together at tables and making the case for why there should be new stations. And ultimately, the state and the T agreed and said this would really help these neighborhoods and make sense to do these new stations. And from there, a lot of the developments that we see now really sort of bloomed and blossomed.
Of course, another interesting part of your book is the notion that if your neighborhood does not have a strong community development corporation, you're missing a lot. What is it about these organizations that are so important to the neighborhoods?
Right. So one of the core arguments here isn't necessarily to argue that people like the mayor or city council members or state representatives are powerless. We wouldn't say that, at all. But what I'm arguing instead is that over time, as these organizations have grown, as they've sat around the table with city policymakers, state policymakers, and even federal policymakers, it has really elevated their status as being the representatives of particularly poor neighborhoods along the Fairmount Corridor. And so we see both CDCs and other organizations that are sort of like CDCs, but maybe not technically CDCs, folks like the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, for instance, that are seen by these people in power, by funders, by public officials as the representatives of these neighborhoods. They turn to these organizations to represent the interest, to tell them what it is that people in those neighborhoods want. All that is great, and in many ways a advance from times when city officials were just plowing through neighborhoods and not really looking toward representatives. On the other hand, what that means is that if you are in a neighborhood where one of those organizations is maybe have lower capacity, is a little bit weaker, or maybe doesn't exist. In my book, I focus in part to show this with the case of Mattapan. In Mattapan, around 2012, so about 9 years ago, the Mattapan Community Development Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. They were out of money, so they ceased to exist. What that meant was not only fewer development opportunities, particularly led by this nonprofit sector in collaboration with government for the neighborhood, but it also meant a limited voice for the residents of Mattapan. While they could still go to public meetings, still exercise their voice in those contexts, they didn't have that same vehicle that other neighborhoods, particularly along the corridor, had to reflect their voice through these organizations. So on the one hand, again, it is a positive development in the sense that it is greater voice, having these organizations represent poor neighborhoods. But on the other hand, when they cease to exist or when they lack sufficient capacity, it can mean suppressed political voice for those neighborhoods relative to other neighborhoods in the city.
When I read this book, I'm reminded about the effectiveness of leaders of some of these CDCs, especially people like Marvin Martin and Gail Lattimore in Codman Square. But on the other hand, these are very professionalized organizations, almost like technocrats in a way, and I think that could lead to a certain estrangement from the neighborhood. Do you worry about that?
That's a great point. And in fact, a big part of the scholarly discussion is sort of critiquing the professionalization, bureaucratization of nonprofit organizations. Part of getting that seat at the table to work alongside, to collaborate with public officials means having more technical expertise, means being a little bit less sort of combative with public officials. And with that then comes a real sacrifice or a cost. And so to me, there's two things I worry about. One is I worry about the lack of organizational diversity when it becomes the case that this becomes the norm, when this becomes what foundation funders fund, right? When this becomes who public officials will interact with. When it gets narrowed down, I think that's a problem. And I think we lose something if we're not supporting enough of the more sort of protest-driven, combative kinds of organizations that I think honestly can have a nice check on the status quo. But I also argue a second thing, which is that there is no such thing as any particular organization accurately reflecting the community, emphasis on the. A central argument, and where the sort of play on words of the title of the book comes from, is that this idea of the community is a construct in and of itself. We're both constructing physically communities, but we're also constructing this idea and collapsing what is in reality a lot of diverse opinions about what should happen in a particular neighborhood. And we're collapsing that when we assume that there is any situation in which any organization could be a better or worse reflection of the community. The reality is, when it comes to a lot of developments, particularly in the Fairmount Corridor and in other neighborhoods in Boston as well, a lot of the discussion and debate is things that may seem really mundane and kind of boring. Should we have 2 stories or 3 stories? Should we have 1 parking space or 2 parking space per apartment? It's kind of, in some ways, ridiculous to assume that any singular organization can have a singular position that reflects an entire community's position on these sort of issues that I think by definition, people are going to have different opinions on. So there's a challenge in accurately representing and having a full range of positions. But I also think this assumption that we can ever have that is a faulty one as well, that we should challenge in addition.
Of course, this book is about neighborhood organizations that are very much driven to satisfy the templates for the foundations. There are formulas, they're the kind of things in the abstract that they fund. And I can see a feedback loop here where they represent the foundation sometimes more than the neighborhoods. How do you break out of that loop and make sure things are being done right?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And you're right. It was kind of shocking to me to see these basically Excel sheets, literal templates, as you put it, of achievements and what the foundation expects a particular grant to result in after the completion of that grant period. Now, one thing, though, I was a little bit surprised about, particularly looking at the whole ecosystem of funders, right? I think there's an assumption, at least in my mind, and perhaps it was a bit naive, that funders exert a lot of top-down authority over their grantees. I was actually surprised to see a lot of pushback, particularly amongst these more powerful representatives of their neighborhoods, the CDCs and so on, that were resisting a lot of foundations that were telling them this is what we want to see, that were pushing back, that were in some ways changing the criteria of those templates. And part of that reason is because that funder group has really expanded and really grown. There's a lot of different kinds of funders. We have community foundations like the Boston Foundation. There are smaller family foundations that focus on things like community organizing in particular, like the Miller Foundation. And then there's these large national foundations like Ford and so on, with headquarters in New York and things like that. And there's a lot of them with a lot of money, and a lot of their grants are being pooled together and repackaged. Just to say nothing, of course, of all the intermediaries, the LISCs, the Enterprise, the Mass Smart Growth Alliance, right? All these different groups are folding together a lot of different money. And in some ways, a lot of funders are accountable to other funders because they're getting grants from funders themselves. And so it places some really interesting constraints on those funders to actually exert as much authority as I thought they would over their over their grantees. And in many ways, I think we can see that as a bit reassuring that there is some room for some of these organizations to be pushing back against funder directives, certainly more than I thought going into this research.
Finally, Jeremy, just a little time here about if people want to track down your book. What's the best way to go get it?
That's great. Thank you. So there are a few different places. Indiebound.org is a great place to purchase the book from independent booksellers. You can also go directly to the Princeton University Press website or any other bookseller website of your choice.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks for having me.
That was Jeremy R. Levine, and the book is Constructing Community. We'll have more news in just a moment.